The book 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, The Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter, is available as a free PDF or as a free audiobook from Libra Vox. The links are below. It was written by Louis Hughes and first published in Milwaukee by the Southside Printing Company in 1897. The author, Louis Hughes, was born in 1832 on a plantation outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, before being sold as a child to go south. His mother was a slave, but his father was white. He does not mention his father in his account, but the impression I get that his mother was the victim of rape by her owner, as often happened. The account starts with his separation from his mother at the age of 10. Both mother and son thought he was going somewhere to do some work for the day, but as it turned out, he was taken to be sold and he never saw his mother again. Whilst at the slave pen, waiting for a buyer, he describes the whippings that took place and how slave owners outsourced punishments to slave traders. As the owners may not have wanted to whip their own slaves, the slaves were whipped by these professionals, and the money thus earned made up a sizable part of the earnings of the slave traders. Slaves were given their 39 strokes of the lash. This was set up as the maximum in colonial days, and the slave pen was a relatively public place, but in more private places, such as on the plantations or other places where the slaves were exploited, the poor slaves undoubtedly got whipped much more. He was eventually sold to Mr. McGee of Pontotoc, Mississippi, who was a doctor and who taught Louis about how medicines worked. This became useful to him in later life, not only as a slave, but also as a free man. Louis worked both in the house and in the fields, the latter when his labor there was required, and he describes in depth how work was organized. One thing that comes through is that he appears to have a certain feeling about being different, as he is from the state of Virginia. He speaks of the whites in the South looking on Virginians as being better slaves than those from Mississippi, the logic being that Virginia was the first slave state in their eyes. One important part of the story is the punishment that were inflicted on slaves. He notes that slaves probably would not dream of freedom if it were not for the punishments which could be inflicted for next to no reason. For example, he cites a time when crops were not planted in an absolutely straight line, being sufficient cause for a whipping, even though an expert possibly couldn't even tell that the line was absolutely straight. At times, slaves themselves would have to carry out the whipping. For example, they would be forced to form a circle, and the victim would have to run around 3 times naked while his fellow slaves used the whip. There could be as many as 50 people in this circle, meaning that the amount of lashes could be 150. Louis, although working in the house, writes of having his ears boxed by a relative of Mr. McGee, and it was this that pushed him into trying to escape the very first time. 100 years later, Malcolm X spoke of the difference between the, as he put it, the house nigger and the field nigger. The former, who identified with the master and would ask, "How are we feeling today?" and consider himself or herself to be better than those slaves toiling outside. Not so Louis. He identifies himself with his fellow slaves and notes the cruel behavior of the slave owners, even when it's not in their interests. When his wife gave birth to twins, it is the neglect of the owners that leads to their deaths, even though those babies would have grown up to be the property of the owners and had a value of several $100s. The neglect was caused by the amount of work that was given to his wife, even though she should have been nursing the children, particularly when they were sick and dying. Louis knew Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was later to be a Confederate general, war criminal, and one of the early leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. He mentions his later massacre of Union POWs after the Battle of Fort Pillow, although of course he didn't actually witness it. He describes his escape attempts in detail, which involves stowing away on a boat going up the Mississippi River. He notes the obvious sympathy of the Northerners for his plight, and although making it to a non-slave state, he was returned south as per the 1850 slave law, which required all escaped slaves to be returned to their owners, wherever they may be in the United States. A reward of $500 was offered for Louis, a huge sum of money for anyone finding him, and probably around 1/3 to 1/4 of his value at auction. Now, for a person finding him, this would have represented, could have been 2 years' pay, something of that nature. The book details further escape attempts and the punishments that followed them. The plantation owners would go to church on Sundays, and on Sunday afternoons they would rent a preacher to come to the slaves. The preacher would emphasize those parts of the scriptures on slavery and what was the position of the black person in the world, to be subservient to whites. The exact parts of the scriptures are not mentioned by the author. Maybe we can have a look at them in another video sometime in the future. After an unsuccessful escape attempt, the owner curses the unfortunate would-be escapee, saying that she would go to hell for attempted theft of property. That is to say, the escaping slave had attempted to steal herself. It goes beyond belief to try and understand the mentality of these owners. Also, what is so hard for me personally to understand is how Louis managed to maintain his belief in the Christian religion and faith in God. Louis writes of the Civil War, how there was general support for it amongst the family where he lived, especially in the early successes of the Confederacy. However, it starts to go wrong when a member of the family, popular not only with the family of the slave owners, but also amongst the slaves. He was killed in action. He died for his country, lamented a member of the family, but Louis pointed out that he did not die for his country, but for rather continuing slavery. Nonetheless, Mr. McGee clearly believed the Confederacy could win the war, and in 1864 decided to buy an island where he would mine salt. Now, on the face of it, this isn't such a bad idea at all, because I actually checked this and found out that salt was in very short supply in the Confederacy due to the Union control of much of the Gulf of Mexico. So that would have been a pretty astute business decision had it worked out. However, he died in January 1865, and this put an end to the business. He hadn't actually passed on his plans to any others in his family, and the family quizzed Louis about the details of the business plan. Obviously, Mr. McGee hadn't shared those with Louis, so he was unable to actually tell them much about him. Nonetheless, Louis went in business for himself when he was still a slave, and his partner was a free man who bought tobacco out of state, and then Louis broke it up into smaller packets and sold it. And he had the good sense not to get stuck with Confederate dollars, but realizing that they would be useless before the end of the war. He was eventually freed thanks to the intervention of Union soldiers, and this happened sometime after the end of the war and the Proclamation of Freedom. He then made his way north, where he eventually went into business. The photograph on the original edition of his book showed a rather refined-looking gentleman at the end of the 19th century, and no one would have guessed that he'd spent the first 33 years of his life as a slave. Now, as a summary, I'm going to add why I chose this moment to actually to do this. Now, I've read lots of slave narratives, and I had in the past sort of considered actually sticking something up on the internet and maybe opening up to discussions with other people who may have read the book or just interested in a quick summary of it. Now, this month, this is still December 2017, and although this may be well in the past by the time you're seeing that, maybe Donald Trump will no longer be president by the time you actually hear that. Now, in December of 2017, this month, there was a special election in Alabama in which the Republican candidate Roy Moore talked of America being great at the times when there was slavery because families stayed together. Of the approximately 650,000 slaves who were sold from one state to another in the 19th century in the United States, approximately 1/4 were married and in their first marriage, and that marriage was broken up by one of the partners being sold, and 1/2 of them involved children being separated from the parents. One of whom was Louis Hughes. So 3/4 of sales involved families being broken up. Now, Louis Hughes never found his mother again. She was, after all, in Virginia the last time he saw her. There was no chance he could find her. He wouldn't even know what her surname was if she had been sold on herself. Very few slaves did find members of their family, but Louis did find his brother due to an absolutely amazing coincidence. I'm not going to tell you what it was, you'll have to read the book. But such coincidence must have been like winning the lottery. There was no central database to consult, and in any case, most slaves could not read or write. So, well, not most, it was extremely rare for a slave to be able to read or write. In the book 12 Years a Slave, you've got Solomon Northrop. He could read or write, but he was kidnapped and sold into slavery, but he was born a free man. He lived the first 30-something years of his life in freedom. So he knew how to read and write. But even in those days, I mean, certainly most white people wouldn't have been able to read or write either. Just sort of educated people could do that. So the chance of finding your family members wasn't much better than zero. And I think in my own case, it was the disgust at Roy Moore's comment that encouraged me to do this short video, and I apologize for bringing modern day politics into something like this, but I'm sure you can understand my reasoning and thinking behind it. If you find this interesting, let me know, because I've read lots of slave narratives, and I am a historian, but not so much. I mean, I'm a Second World War historian, European historian, but I've done no original research of anything in the United States. Having said that, I have read the books, and I do check things out occasionally if something, and I do try to find out where the slaves lived. And thanks to Google Maps, you can actually you can work out more or less where they were held and see what the plantations look like today, which is quite fascinating, really. I'm going to actually talk about 12 Years a Slave as well. You may have seen the wonderful film by Steve McQueen from 2013, and the book is absolutely outstanding as well. So I'm going to be doing that, and probably be in a little bit more detail than I've done on this one. But Louis Hughes, really absolutely recommend it, and you can get the audio book. You can have it on in the car or whatever you're doing something else. It's really, I mean, I couldn't put it down. Okay, I listened to it in the car, but I couldn't. It was such really a wonderful book. Thank you.